You wouldn't last a week as a medieval peasant. Neither would I, but millions of people lived this life for centuries, and their story is wild. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. I love seeing listeners from all corners of the world. Now let's go back 1,000 years. In the green hills of England, in the years when the second millennium was still young, there lived people whose names were never written down. They left no monuments, commanded no armies, signed no treaties. They were born in small cottages with dirt floors, lived their lives within a few miles of where they entered the world, and died without anyone beyond their village ever knowing they had existed. They were the peasants, the common folk, the vast majority of the medieval population. For every king whose deeds fill the chronicles, there were thousands upon thousands of these ordinary people, tilling the soil, tending the animals, raising children, and making do with whatever the seasons brought them. Their story is the story of medieval life as it was actually lived, not in castles and cathedrals, but in the fields and cottages where most of humanity spent its days. Let us enter that world now, leaving behind the noise and complexity of our own time, traveling back across the centuries to a place where life moved to different rhythms, where the concerns that occupy us would have seemed strange and incomprehensible, and where the things we take for granted had not yet been imagined. The village we are visiting has no particular name that would mean anything to you. It sits in a shallow valley, surrounded by fields that have been cultivated for generations beyond memory. A stream runs through the lower meadows, providing water for the animals and power for the mill. The church stands on a small rise at one end of the settlement, its stone tower visible for miles around, a landmark for travelers and a reminder of the faith that shaped every aspect of village life. The cottages cluster near the church, perhaps 30 or 40 of them, simple structures of timber and thatch, mud and wattle. Smoke rises from holes in the roofs, for there are no chimneys in these humble dwellings, and the interior walls are blackened with centuries of soot. The doors are low, and anyone of modern height would have to stoop to enter. The windows, where they exist at all, are small openings covered with oiled cloth or wooden shutters, letting in little light even at midday. Around the cottages lie the gardens where the peasants grow vegetables and herbs for their own use. Beyond the gardens stretch the great open fields where the crops are grown, divided into long, narrow strips that belong to different families. The Lord's manor house stands apart from the village, larger and more substantial than the cottages, but modest by the standards of the nobility, surrounded by its own enclosures and outbuildings. This is the world we are entering, a world that existed across Europe for centuries, that shaped the lives of countless millions, and that has left its traces in the landscape and the language, in customs and traditions that persist in altered forms even today. It is a world worth understanding, not because it was better or worse than our own, but because it was human as any time or place has ever been. The year is somewhere in the 13th century, though the exact date matters little, for life in villages like this one changed slowly, and the routines that governed one generation governed the next with little variation. The king on his distant throne might change, wars might be fought and won or lost, but the rhythm of planting and harvest, of birth and death, continued regardless of what happened in the wider world. We begin our story in late winter, when the days are beginning to lengthen but the cold still grips the land, when the stores laid up in autumn are running low and everyone watches anxiously for the first signs of spring. In the cottage at the edge of the village, nearest to the eastern fields, a family is waking to another day. The father is called Thomas, a name given to him by the priest who baptized him in the parish church nearly 40 years ago. His wife is Agnes, and together they have brought 7 children into the world, of whom 4 still live. The dead ones are buried in the churchyard, their small graves marked by wooden crosses that will rot away within a generation, leaving no trace of lives that ended before they properly began. Thomas is awake before dawn, as he is every day of his life. He lies for a moment in the darkness, listening to the breathing of his family around him, the rustling of the animals in the far end of the cottage, the distant crow of a rooster announcing the coming day. The straw mattress beneath him is thin and lumpy, and the woolen blanket that covers him does little to keep out the chill that seeps through the walls. He rises quietly, trying not to disturb Agnes, though she is already awake, as she always is when he stirs. The floor is cold beneath his bare feet, packed earth that turns to mud when the rains are heavy. He pulls on his tunic, a rough garment of undyed wool that he has worn for years, patched and repatched by Agnes until it is more repair than original cloth. The cottage is a single room, perhaps 20 feet long and 15 wide. At one end, behind a low partition, the family's animals spend the night: a cow, a pig, and a few chickens. Their warmth helps heat the dwelling, and their presence is so familiar that Thomas barely notices the smell that would overwhelm a modern visitor. At the other end, the family sleeps, parents and children sharing the limited space, privacy a concept that belongs to the wealthy. In the center of the room, the hearth glows faintly with the embers of last night's fire. Thomas kneels and blows gently, coaxing the coals back to life, adding small sticks and then larger pieces of wood until the flames catch and begin to spread their warmth and light. This fire is the heart of the household, never allowed to go completely out, tended as carefully as a living thing. Agnes rises and begins preparing the morning meal, a simple porridge of oats and water, perhaps flavored with a little salt or honey if they have any. The children wake one by one, the oldest first, a boy of 14 named John who will soon be considered a man, then the girls, Emma and Alice, then the youngest, a boy of 6 named William who is still young enough to be indulged. The family eats together, sitting on low stools or on the floor, sharing wooden bowls and horn spoons. There is little conversation, for the day's work awaits and energy must be conserved. The porridge is filling if not particularly flavorful, fuel for bodies that will labor from dawn to dusk. When the meal is finished, Thomas and John prepare to go to the fields. The work at this time of year is preparation for the coming planting season. The fields that were left fallow last year must be plowed, the soil turned and broken, the weeds that have grown up over the winter chopped and buried. It is hard physical labor, the kind that builds muscle and breaks bodies, that leaves a man exhausted at the end of the day and does the same again the next. Thomas owns no plow of his own. Few peasants do, for a plow is an expensive piece of equipment, beyond the means of most families. Instead, the village shares a few plows among all the households, each family taking their turn, helping with the work when it is not their own strips being tilled. This cooperation is not optional charity but necessity. No family can survive alone, and the bonds that tie the villagers together are as essential as the tools they use. The plow itself is a heavy wooden frame fitted with an iron blade, pulled by a team of oxen that also belong to the village collectively. Guiding the plow requires skill and strength, for the oxen are powerful but not particularly intelligent, and the blade must be kept at the right depth and angle to turn the soil properly. Too shallow and the weeds will not be buried. Too deep and the plow will stick and the oxen will strain. Thomas has been plowing since he was John's age, and his hands know the work even when his mind wanders. He walks behind the plow, his feet sinking into the freshly turned earth, watching the furrow unroll before him like a brown ribbon across the gray field. John walks beside the oxen, guiding them with a long stick, learning the work that will be his own responsibility someday. The field they are plowing today is part of the common land, worked by all the villagers together, the harvest shared according to a system of obligations and rights that has been in place for generations. Each family has strips in this field and in the others that surround the village, scattered and intermingled, so that no one family has all the best land or all the worst. It is an inefficient system by modern standards, but it has a rough fairness that the peasants understand and accept. The morning passes slowly, the plow moving back and forth across the field, the furrows multiplying one by one. Other families are working nearby, each tending their own strips, and there is occasional conversation, news exchanged, jokes told, complaints about the weather or the Lord or the endless labor that fills their days. But mostly there is just the work, the steady rhythm of steps and breath, the creak of the plow and the snorting of the oxen. At midday, the work pauses. Agnes has sent Emma with a basket containing bread and cheese, a leather flask of weak ale. Thomas and John sit at the edge of the field, eating their simple meal, resting muscles that ache from the morning's labor. The sun is pale and watery, offering little warmth, but at least the rain has held off. Plowing in the rain is miserable work, the mud sucking at every step, the oxen reluctant and difficult to manage. The afternoon continues as the morning did, more plowing, more furrows, the slow transformation of fallow field into prepared ground. By the time the light begins to fail, Thomas and John have covered perhaps an acre. A good day's work, but only a fraction of what must be done before planting can begin. Tomorrow they will return, and the day after, and the day after that, until the work is complete or the season forces them to stop. The walk back to the village is quiet. Thomas is tired in his bones, the kind of tiredness that comes from honest labor that makes the prospect of rest genuinely welcome. John walks beside him, equally tired, his young body still adjusting to the demands of adult work. Neither speaks much, for there is little to say that has not been said 1,000 times before. Agnes has prepared the evening meal, a pottage of vegetables and barley, thickened with a little bacon fat saved from better times. The family gathers around the hearth, eating from a common pot, dipping their bread into the thick broth. The fire crackles and pops, casting dancing shadows on the soot-blackened walls. After supper, there is still work to be done, though of a quieter kind. Agnes spins wool by the firelight, her fingers moving automatically as the spindle twirls and the thread grows longer. Emma and Alice help with the spinning, or practice the sewing that they will need to know as wives and mothers. The boys mend tools or tend to small tasks that need doing. Thomas sits and watches, too tired for much activity, letting his mind drift towards sleep. The priest says there will be a service on Sunday, and the Lord Steward has announced that the manor court will meet next week to settle disputes and record transfers of land. These are the events that punctuate the routine of village life, the moments when the community gathers and remembers that it is more than just a collection of isolated families. But for now, there is only the cottage and the fire, the family and the approaching night. When the fire burns low and the work is set aside, the family prepares for sleep. Prayers are said, simple words learned in childhood and repeated every night without much thought to their meaning. The children settle onto their straw pallets, pulling blankets over themselves, curling together for warmth. Thomas and Agnes do the same, lying side by side as they have for nearly 20 years, their bodies fitting together with the comfort of long familiarity. The cottage grows quiet. The animals shift and settle in their corner. Outside, the village is dark and still, only the occasional bark of a dog or hoot of an owl breaking the silence. The stars wheel overhead, the same stars that have watched over this land since before humans walked upon it, indifferent to the small lives being lived beneath them. The weeks pass and the season slowly turns. The plowing is finished, the fields harrowed and ready for seed. The days grow longer and warmer, and the first green shoots begin to appear in the gardens and meadows. The streams run high with snowmelt from the distant hills, and the mill wheel turns steadily, grinding the last of last year's grain into flour. Planting is a time of hope and anxiety. The seed that goes into the ground represents the food that will sustain the family through the coming year. If it germinates well and grows strong, if the rains come when they are needed and the sun shines when it should, if no blight or pest destroys the crop, then there will be bread on the table and perhaps even a little surplus to sell or trade. If any of these conditions fails, there will be hunger and possibly worse. Thomas walks his strips with a bag of seed slung over his shoulder, broadcasting the grain with practiced sweeps of his arm. The seed falls in golden arcs, landing on the dark earth, disappearing into the soil as he moves forward. Behind him, John follows with a harrow, dragging it over the seeded ground to cover the grain and protect it from birds. The whole village is engaged in this work, every able-bodied person contributing to the effort. Children too young for heavy labor are set to scaring birds, running through the fields with sticks and noise, keeping the crows and pigeons from eating the precious seed before it can sprout. Older people too frail for walking the fields do what they can, mending fences, watching over the youngest children, preparing meals for the workers. There is something almost festive about planting time, despite the hard work involved. The long confinement of winter is ending, the worst of the cold is past, and there is hope in the air, the sense that better times are coming. The villagers work alongside each other, share meals and conversation, renew the bonds that hold the community together. Agnes works in the garden behind the cottage, planting vegetables that will supplement the family's diet through the summer and fall. Cabbages and onions, beans and peas, turnips and parsnips, each has its place in the carefully tended plot. Herbs grow along the borders, some for flavoring food, others for medicine. Their use is known to every woman in the village. The garden is Agnes's domain, as the fields are Thomas's. She knows every inch of it, knows which patches drain well and which stay wet, knows where the sun falls longest and where the shade lingers. She has been working this same piece of ground since she came to this cottage as a young bride, and she will work it until she is too old or too sick to continue, at which point one of her daughters or daughters-in-law will take over. The children help where they can, pulling weeds, carrying water, learning the skills they will need as adults. William is still too young for much useful work, but he tags along behind his mother, watching and occasionally helping, absorbing knowledge that he does not yet know he is acquiring. Emma and Alice are more useful, their hands quick and their eyes sharp, already capable of doing much of the work themselves. The days grow longer still, and the planted seeds begin to sprout. Thin green lines appear in the brown fields, the first evidence that the seed has taken, that the cycle of growth has begun again. Thomas walks his strips in the early morning, checking the progress of the crop, looking for any sign of trouble. So far, everything looks good. The rains have been adequate, the sun has been warm and the seedlings are strong and healthy. But it is too early to relax. The crop is vulnerable at this stage, susceptible to late frosts that can kill the tender shoots, to heavy rains that can wash away the soil, to pests and diseases that can devastate a field in a matter of days. The weeks between planting and harvest are a time of watchful waiting, of hoping and praying and doing what can be done to protect the growing grain. The church calendar marks the passing of the spring with saints' days and holy days, occasions for rest from labor and gathering for worship. Easter comes, the greatest feast of the Christian year, celebrating the resurrection of Christ and the promise of salvation. The village gathers in the church for services that begin before dawn and continue through the morning, the priest intoning the Latin words that few of the congregation understand but all find comforting. After the services, there is feasting, modest by the standards of the wealthy but welcome after the lean months of late winter. Every family contributes what it can, and for one day at least, there is enough for everyone. The children run and play, released from the routine of work and chores. The adults sit and talk, enjoying the rare luxury of leisure. Thomas and Agnes sit together near the church, watching their children, feeling the warmth of the spring sun on their faces. They do not speak much, but there is a contentment in their silence, a satisfaction in having survived another winter, another planting, another round of the endless cycle that has shaped their lives and the lives of their ancestors for generations beyond counting. Summer comes, and with it the long days of tending the growing crop. The fields must be weeded, the unwanted plants that would compete with the grain for water and nutrients pulled out by hand, row after endless row. It is tedious, back-breaking work, crawling along the ground, fingers gripping and pulling, the sun beating down on bent backs. Everyone participates in the weeding, even the youngest children, for there are simply too many weeds for the adults to handle alone. William works alongside his mother and sisters in the garden, learning to distinguish the plants they want from the plants they do not, making mistakes that are gently corrected. In the fields, Thomas and John move methodically through the strips, clearing each one before moving to the next. The days are hot and the work is exhausting. The sun rises early and sets late, and every hour of light must be used. There is no time for rest during the daylight hours, only the endless labor of keeping the crop alive and healthy. Meals are eaten quickly, in the shade of a tree or the shadow of a hedge before the work resumes. The evening brings relief, a few hours of cooler temperatures and dimmer light before the darkness falls and sleep becomes possible. The family gathers outside the cottage, sitting on the ground or on rough benches, letting the breeze cool their sweating skin. Neighbors stop by to exchange news, to share a drink of ale or a bit of gossip. The children play until they are called to bed, chasing each other through the lanes of the village, their laughter echoing in the twilight. These are the long days, the heart of the agricultural year, when the success or failure of the harvest hangs in the balance. Thomas watches the sky constantly, reading the clouds for signs of rain, the wind for hints of storm. Too much water will rot the roots, too little will wither the stalks. The balance is delicate, and it is largely out of human control. But this year, the balance holds. The rains come when they are needed, gentle showers that soak the soil without flooding it. The sun shines when the rains pause, warming the earth and driving the plants upward. The wheat grows tall and strong, the heads beginning to form, the grain inside slowly ripening toward the golden color of harvest. The garden flourishes as well. Agnes picks vegetables daily now, bringing in cabbages and beans, peas and onions, filling the pottage pot with fresh produce that tastes better than anything they have eaten since last autumn. There is still bread to be made from the dwindling store of last year's flour, but the garden supplements the grain, providing variety and nutrition that the grain alone cannot offer. Midsummer arrives, the longest day of the year, marked by bonfires and celebrations that stretch back to pagan times, now given a thin Christian veneer. The villagers gather in the fields as the sun sets, lighting fires that will burn through the brief darkness of the shortest night. There is singing and dancing, drinking and laughter, a release of the tensions that have built up through the long weeks of labor. Thomas does not dance, for he has never been comfortable with such displays, but he watches the young people with something like fondness, remembering when he was one of them, when the midsummer fire seemed magical rather than merely traditional. Agnes sits beside him, her hand in his, remembering the same things, sharing the same quiet contentment. The night passes and the dawn comes and the work resumes. The crop is nearly mature now, the heads heavy with grain, bending the stalks toward the ground. Soon it will be time for harvest, the most critical and most exhausting period of the agricultural year. Everything that has been done since winter will come to fruition in a few weeks of intense labor, and the results will determine whether the family eats well or goes hungry. Thomas sharpens his sickle, checking the blade for nicks and chips, making sure it is ready for the work ahead. John does the same, his movements mimicking his father's, learning by imitation as peasants have always learned. The tools of harvest are simple but essential, and they must be maintained with care, for there is no time to repair them once the cutting begins. The final weeks before harvest are a time of waiting. The grain must be fully ripe before it is cut, but not so ripe that it falls from the heads and is lost. The timing is crucial, and Thomas checks the fields daily, rubbing the heads between his palms, testing the hardness of the grain, watching the color change from green to gold. And then one morning in late summer he makes the decision. The grain is ready. Tomorrow the harvest begins. Harvest is the climax of the agricultural year, the moment when all the work of plowing and planting, weeding and watching comes together in a final burst of effort. The grain must be cut and gathered, bound into sheaves and carried to the barns, all before the weather turns or the crop is lost. Every person in the village who can hold a sickle or carry a bundle is pressed into service, working from dawn to dusk in the golden fields. Thomas is among the first to begin cutting, his sickle swinging in a steady rhythm, the sharp blade slicing through the stalks, the grain falling in neat rows behind him. John works alongside him, matching his pace as best he can, learning the motion that will be part of his life for decades to come. Other men from the village are spread across the fields, each working his own strips but all contributing to the collective effort. Behind the cutters come the women and children, gathering the fallen stalks into bundles, tying them with bands of twisted straw, standing the sheaves upright so they can dry in the sun. Agnes and the girls work among them, their hands moving quickly, the sweat running down their faces, the dust of the grain coating their clothes and skin. The work is exhausting but also exhilarating. There is a sense of accomplishment in watching the standing crop become rows of sheaves, in knowing that each bundle represents food for the coming year. The villagers call encouragement to each other, share jokes and complaints, compete informally to see who can cut or bind the most. The atmosphere is intense but not grim, for this is the purpose toward which the whole year has been aimed. The days blur together, one much like another, a continuous cycle of cutting and binding, carrying and stacking. Meals are eaten in the fields, brought out by the older women and youngest children, simple food that can be consumed quickly before the work resumes. Sleep comes in short snatches, grabbed whenever there is a pause in the labor, never enough to fully restore the tired body. The weather holds, a blessing that everyone acknowledges with prayers of thanks. The sun shines during the day, drying the cut grain and allowing it to be safely gathered. The nights are clear and cool, letting the workers rest without the discomfort of heat or the fear of rain. In other years, storms have come at harvest time, destroying crops that were on the verge of being saved. This year, the heavens are kind. As the harvest progresses, the mood in the village shifts from anxious effort to growing satisfaction. The barns are filling with sheaves, the fields are emptying of standing grain, and it becomes clear that this will be a good year, perhaps a very good year. The yield is excellent, better than anyone had dared to hope, and there will be plenty to meet the Lord's demands, pay the tithes to the church, and still have enough left over for the family's needs. The final day of harvest arrives, and with it, a sense of celebration. The last sheaves are cut with ceremony, the last bundles bound with care. The oldest woman in the village ties the final sheaf, a ritual that brings good luck for the coming year. Then the work is done, the fields are empty, and the harvest is safely gathered. That evening, the lord of the manor provides a feast for the workers, as custom requires. Tables are set up in the yard of the manor house, loaded with bread and meat, cheese and ale, more food than most of the peasants see at any other time of year. The villagers eat and drink their fill, celebrating the end of harvest, the completion of another agricultural cycle. Thomas sits among his neighbors, feeling the pleasant warmth of the ale spreading through his tired body. Agnes is beside him, the children nearby, all of them fed and happy in this moment of rest and plenty. The conversation flows around them, laughter and stories, complaints and boasts, the ordinary talk of people who have worked hard and earned their reward. The feast continues into the night, lit by torches and bonfires, the darkness held back by flame and fellowship. Some of the younger people dance, their energy seemingly inexhaustible despite the weeks of labor. Others sit and talk, or simply watch, content to be present at this gathering of the community. Eventually, the feast winds down. The food is consumed, the ale is drunk, and one by one the families drift away, heading back to their cottages for the first full night of sleep in weeks. Thomas and Agnes walk slowly, the children stumbling along beside them, everyone too tired for much conversation but content in their weariness. The cottage is dark and quiet when they arrive. The fire has burned low, and there is no light except what filters in through the gaps in the walls. But no light is needed. They know this space as well as they know their own bodies, and they find their way to their beds without difficulty. Sleep comes quickly, deep and dreamless, the sleep of exhaustion finally finding rest. Tomorrow there will be more work, there is always more work, but for tonight there is only peace, the peace of labor completed and reward earned. Autumn follows harvest, a season of preparation for the winter ahead. The grain must be threshed and winnowed, separated from the chaff and stalks, stored in bins and bags against the months when nothing will grow. The animals must be tended, some slaughtered for meat, others prepared for the long confinement of winter. The fields must be cleared and some of them plowed again, readied for the following year's crop. The pace of work slows from the frantic intensity of harvest but does not stop. There is always something to be done, always another task waiting. Thomas spends his days in the barn, swinging the flail that knocks the grain from the heads, breathing the dust that fills the air, counting the bushels as they accumulate. John works beside him, learning this task as he has learned all the others. The weather turns cooler, and the days grow shorter. The leaves change color on the trees that line the edges of the fields, reds and oranges and yellows that brighten the landscape before falling to the ground and returning to the earth. There is beauty in this season, a quiet loveliness that Thomas notices even though he has seen it every year of his life. Agnes is busy with her own preparations, preserving vegetables from the garden, salting meat from the pig they have slaughtered, storing everything carefully so it will last through the months ahead. The girls help with this work, learning the skills of household management that they will need when they have homes of their own. The church calendar marks the passing of autumn with its own rhythm of feasts and fasts. All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day remind the villagers of those who have gone before, the dead who lie in the churchyard waiting for the resurrection. The priest says masses for their souls, and the living remember them in their prayers. Martinmas comes in November, the traditional day for slaughtering animals that will not be fed through the winter. The village gathers for this necessary but bloody work, killing pigs and cattle, preserving the meat in salt or smoke, using every part of the animal that can possibly be used. Nothing is wasted, for waste is a sin in a world where scarcity is always close at hand. The first frosts come, whitening the ground in the early morning, killing the last of the garden plants, signaling that winter is approaching. Thomas and Agnes bring in the final harvest of vegetables, store them in the root cellar dug beneath the cottage, check and recheck their supplies of food and fuel. They have done this every year of their married life, and they know what they need to survive, but the anxiety never entirely goes away. The days grow shorter still, the darkness pressing in from both ends, the light a precious resource to be used wisely. Work moves indoors to tasks that can be done by firelight, spinning and weaving, mending and making. The family gathers around the hearth in the long evenings, their circle of warmth and light surrounded by the cold darkness outside. Winter arrives, and the village settles into its seasonal rhythm. The fields are bare and frozen, nothing growing, nothing to tend. The animals are confined in their shelters, fed from the stores of hay and grain, their breath steaming in the cold air. The peasants stay close to their cottages, venturing out only when necessary, conserving their energy for the long months ahead. Christmas comes, the great feast of the Nativity, celebrated with what festivity the village can muster. The church is decorated with greenery, and the priest conducts services that mark the birth of Christ and the promise of salvation. There is feasting, modest but welcome, and the lord of the manor provides gifts of food to his tenants, acknowledging the obligations that bind the community together. The 12 days of Christmas stretch from the Feast of the Nativity to the Feast of the Epiphany, a period of relative rest in the agricultural calendar. Thomas uses the time to mend tools and equipment, to plan for the coming year, to simply rest and recover from the labors of the seasons past. Agnes uses it to catch up on household tasks, to spend time with her children, to visit with neighbors and friends. But the rest cannot last forever. Twelfth night passes, and the routines of winter resume. There is always work to be done, always something that needs attention, always the slow countdown towards spring and the beginning of another agricultural cycle. The weeks pass, one much like another, the days short and cold, the nights long and dark. February brings the first hints of the approaching spring, the days growing slightly longer, the coldest weather beginning to moderate. Thomas begins to think about plowing again, about seed and soil, about the endless cycle that has shaped his life and will shape it until he dies. And then one morning, he notices that the ice on the stream has begun to thin, that the birds are singing differently, that something in the air has changed. Spring is coming. The cycle is beginning again. The years pass in this way, one flowing into another, each following the same pattern of planting and harvest, work and rest, feast and fast. Thomas grows older, his body accumulating the aches and pains that come from decades of hard labor. Agnes grows older beside him, her hair turning gray, her movements slowing, her face marked by the passage of time. The children grow as well, passing through the stages of life that their parents passed through before them. John marries a girl from a neighboring village and takes over more and more of the work in the fields. Emma and Alice marry too, finding husbands among the young men of the village, establishing households of their own. William grows from a boy into a man, following the path that his brother and father walked before him. Grandchildren arrive, new lives that carry the blood of Thomas and Agnes forward into the future. The cottage that once seemed crowded with 4 children now seems quiet, the spaces where they used to sleep empty, their voices replaced by the sounds of their own children in their own homes. Death comes too, as it always does. Agnes's mother, who lived in a cottage on the other side of the village, dies one winter after a brief illness. The village gathers for her burial, the priest saying the words that consign her body to the earth and her soul to God. Agnes weeps and Thomas holds her, and the loss becomes part of the fabric of their lives. Others die as well. Neighbors who have been part of the village for as long as anyone can remember. Children who do not survive their first year. Young people taken by accident or disease before they have a chance to grow old. The churchyard fills slowly with the bodies of those who have gone before, a silent congregation of the dead that grows larger with each passing year. But life continues as it always does. New babies are born to replace those who have died. Young couples marry and establish new households. The village endures, changing gradually but never transformed, the same routines and rituals repeated generation after generation. Thomas watches these changes with the eyes of age, seeing in the young people the faces of their parents and grandparents, recognizing patterns that repeat themselves across the decades. He has become an elder of the village, consulted on matters of custom and tradition, respected for his experience even as his body grows weaker. The work has passed mostly to younger hands now. John runs the family strips, makes the decisions about planting and harvest, deals with the Lord's steward and the village officials. Thomas helps when he can, offering advice and the labor of hands that are still capable, but he knows that his time of active work is ending. Agnes has passed through the same transition. Her daughters and daughters-in-law run their own households now, and she is a visitor rather than a mistress in their homes. She helps with grandchildren, shares wisdom about cooking and preserving, but the daily responsibility has passed to the next generation. There is loss in this transition, the loss of purpose and relevance that comes when the work that defined a life is no longer necessary. But there is also freedom, the freedom to rest after decades of labor, to watch and remember rather than constantly do. Thomas and Agnes have earned this rest, and they accept it with a mixture of gratitude and something like grief. The seasons continue their rotation, spring following winter, summer following spring, autumn following summer, the cycle as reliable as the rising and setting of the sun. Thomas marks the passing of time by the church calendar, the feast days and fast days that punctuate the year, the services and sermons that have been part of his life since he was old enough to walk to the church. He thinks sometimes about what will come after, about the heaven that the priest promises to those who live good lives and receive the sacraments of the church. He has tried to be a good man, has worked hard and cared for his family, has said his prayers and made his confessions. He hopes that this will be enough, that when his time comes he will find himself in that place of eternal rest, where there is no more labor and no more pain. But he does not dwell on these thoughts. There is still life to be lived, still days to be experienced, still the simple pleasures of food and fire, family and friends. The future will come when it comes. For now, there is only the present, only this moment, only the gift of another day in the world that has been his home for so many years. The illness comes in winter, as such things often do. Thomas wakes one morning with a cough and a heaviness in his chest, and within a few days he is confined to his bed, too weak to rise, too sick to eat. Agnes tends to him as she has always tended to him, bringing water and thin broth, changing the blankets when they become soaked with sweat, praying the prayers that are all she knows to do. The priest comes to hear his confession and give him the last rites, the sacraments that prepare the soul for its departure from the body. Thomas whispers his sins, the small transgressions of a simple life, and receives absolution. The priest anoints his forehead with oil and speaks the words that have been spoken over countless dying people, commending his soul to the mercy of God. The family gathers, children and grandchildren filling the small cottage, their faces grave with the knowledge that the end is approaching. John stands nearest to the bed, ready to assume the full responsibility of the family when his father is gone. Agnes sits beside Thomas, holding his hand, her face wet with tears that she does not bother to wipe away. The hours pass slowly. Thomas drifts in and out of consciousness, sometimes aware of the people around him, sometimes lost in dreams or memories that only he can see. He speaks occasionally, words that do not always make sense, fragments of thoughts that have been part of his life. He thinks of his parents, dead these many years, buried in the churchyard that he will soon join. He thinks of his children when they were young, their faces bright with laughter, their lives stretching before them full of possibility. He thinks of Agnes, the girl he married so many years ago, the woman who has shared his life and his bed, the partner who has been beside him through everything. The end comes quietly, as a candle flame gutters and dies. His breathing slows, grows shallow, and then stops. Agnes feels his hand go limp in hers and knows that he is gone. She leans forward and kisses his forehead, a final gesture of love for the man she has loved for most of her life. The family weeps, as families do when death comes. The women keen and the men stand silent, each processing the loss in their own way. The priest is summoned to say the prayers for the dead, and the body is prepared for burial, washed and wrapped in a shroud of clean linen. The burial takes place the next day, in the churchyard where so many others lie. The whole village attends, for Thomas was known and respected, a good man by the standards of his community. The priest speaks the words of committal, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and the body is lowered into the grave. Agnes stands at the edge of the grave, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, watching as the earth is shoveled over the body of her husband. She feels old, older than she has ever felt, as if the years have suddenly caught up with her all at once. But she also feels something else, something like peace, the knowledge that Thomas has gone to a better place and that she will join him there in time. The villagers disperse, returning to their homes and their work, the routines of life resuming even as one life has ended. The grave is marked with a simple wooden cross, carved with Thomas's name and the year of his death. Within a generation, the cross will rot away, and there will be nothing to show where he lies except a slight depression in the ground. But the memory will last longer. Agnes will remember him until her own death, and the children will remember him for years after that. The grandchildren will tell stories about him, stories that will become vaguer and more distorted with each retelling, until eventually he will fade into the general mass of ancestors, known only as someone who lived and died in this village, one of the countless people who made up the history that no one recorded. Agnes lives on for a few more years, growing frailer but never losing the spark that animated her life. She moves into the cottage of her eldest son, giving up the home she shared with Thomas, accepting the care of her children as she once cared for them. She watches her grandchildren grow, sees the youngest ones learn to walk and talk, passes on what wisdom she has to the generations that will follow. Her death, when it comes, is gentle. She falls asleep one evening and does not wake up, her body simply stopping as a clock stops when its spring runs down. The family mourns her, buries her beside Thomas in the churchyard, marks her grave with another wooden cross that will rot away in its turn. The village continues. New families arise to take the place of those that end. New babies are born, grow up, marry, have children of their own, grow old, and die. The cycle repeats itself. Generation after generation, century after century, the same patterns playing out in slightly different ways. The cottage where Thomas and Agnes lived passes to their children, then to their grandchildren, then to descendants whose connection to the original family is lost in the tangled web of marriages and inheritances. The fields they worked are still worked, the strips they tilled still producing grain, the rhythms they followed still governing the lives of those who come after. The church still stands on its small rise, its stone tower still visible for miles around. The priest who baptized Thomas's grandchildren is succeeded by another priest, and another, each one serving the parish for a time and then passing on. The services continue, the Latin words intoned, the rituals observed, the faith maintained. The lord of the manor changes too, as lords always change, through death and inheritance, through the shifting fortunes of noble families. Some lords are kind and some are harsh, some are present and some are absent, but the basic relationship remains the same, the peasants working the land and owing obligations to the lord who holds it. The wider world changes in ways that the villagers only dimly perceive. Kings rise and fall, wars are fought and won or lost, plagues sweep across the land killing millions. New ideas and technologies slowly transform the conditions of life. But in the village, the changes come slowly, filtered through the needs and traditions of a community that measures time by the seasons rather than by the reigns of kings. The Black Death comes in the middle of the 14th century, killing perhaps a third of the village in a single terrible year. The survivors bury their dead and carry on, for there is no alternative, and within a generation the population has begun to recover. The plague returns periodically over the following centuries, never again as devastating as that first outbreak, but always a reminder of the fragility of life. The feudal system that has governed village life for centuries begins to weaken and change. Peasants who were once bound to the land gain freedoms that their ancestors never had. Money becomes more important, labor becomes more valuable, and the old patterns of obligation and service slowly give way to new arrangements. The village remains, but the relationships that hold it together are transformed. The Reformation comes, and the church that has been the center of village life for 1,000 years is suddenly different. The statues and paintings are removed. The Latin services are replaced by English ones. The priest is expected to marry and live like other men. Some villagers embrace the changes, some resist them, most simply adapt, as peasants have always adapted to whatever circumstances they find themselves in. The centuries pass. The village that Thomas knew would be barely recognizable to its inhabitants of the 17th or 18th century, and utterly foreign to those of the 19th or 20th. The cottages are rebuilt and expanded, the fields are enclosed and redistributed, the church is renovated and restored. Only the land remains the same, the hills and valleys, the streams and meadows, the earth that has supported human life since long before Thomas was born. And yet something persists, something that connects the present to the past. The people who live in this place today are descendants of those who lived here centuries ago, their blood carrying the genes of Thomas and Agnes and all the others whose names have been forgotten. The routines of rural life, though transformed by technology and economics, still follow patterns established in the medieval period. The church still stands, still holds services, still marks the passages of life from birth to death. The story of Thomas and Agnes is the story of countless millions of people whose lives have been lost to history. They did not write books or build monuments, did not command armies or rule kingdoms. They simply lived, worked, loved, and died, as human beings have done in every time and place. Their story is not dramatic or exceptional. It is ordinary, and that is precisely what makes it worth telling. For the ordinary is the foundation of everything else. The kings and lords, the priests and merchants, the artists and scholars, all of them depended on the labor of people like Thomas and Agnes, people who grew the food and made the goods that sustained civilization. Without the peasants, there would have been no cathedrals, no universities, no crusades, no Renaissance. The grand narrative of history rests on the shoulders of those whose individual stories were never recorded. To remember them, even in imagination, even in a story told for the purpose of helping listeners drift off to sleep, is to honor what they did and who they were. It is to acknowledge that history is not only about the famous and the powerful, but also about the ordinary and the forgotten. It is to recognize that every human life has value, that every person who has ever lived has been the center of their own story, as important to themselves as any king or conqueror. Thomas and Agnes are gone now, have been gone for centuries, their bones long since returned to the earth from which they came. But in telling their story, we bring them back for a moment, give them a kind of life in the minds of those who listen. They walk again through the fields of their village, sit again by the fire in their cottage, hold again the hands of their children and grandchildren. This is the power of story, the power to preserve what would otherwise be lost, to connect the present to the past, to remind us that we are not alone in our humanity, but part of a vast community that stretches back to the beginning of time and forward to its end. We are links in a chain, inheritors of all that came before us, ancestors of all that will come after. The medieval peasants knew this in their way. They lived in communities where memory was preserved through oral tradition, where the stories of ancestors were told and retold around the fire, where the past was always present in the land and the customs and the faces of family members. They did not have our books and records, our photographs and videos, but they had their stories, and the stories kept the dead alive in the minds of the living. We have lost much of this in our modern world. We are disconnected from our ancestors in ways that would have horrified the medieval villager. We do not know the names of our great-great-grandparents, do not know where they lived or what they did, do not feel the connection to the past that was once a fundamental part of human identity. But we can recover some of it through imagination and empathy, through the willingness to enter into lives very different from our own. We can tell the stories of those who came before, even when we do not know their names, even when we must invent the details that history has not preserved. We can honor them by remembering them, by acknowledging that they were real, that they mattered, that their lives had meaning even if that meaning has been forgotten. Thomas and Agnes were real, or people like them were real, and that is enough. Their story is a true story, even if the specific details are invented, because it captures the truth of how people lived in the medieval period, the truth of the cycles of labor and rest, the truth of the bonds of family and community, the truth of the faith that sustained them and the fears that troubled them. Let that truth settle into your mind as you prepare for sleep. Let the images of the medieval village stay with you, the cottage and the hearth, the fields and the church, the people whose lives were so different from yours, and yet so fundamentally the same. Let the rhythms of their year, the planting and the harvest, the feasts and the fasts, become part of your own inner landscape. And as you drift towards sleep, remember that you too are part of this great human story, this endless chain of generations that stretches back into the darkness of prehistory and forward into the unknown future. You too will be remembered or forgotten as the centuries pass. You too will become an ancestor, a link in the chain, a voice in the chorus of humanity that echoes across time. The fire burns low in the cottage hearth. The family sleeps, curled together for warmth, their breathing slow and steady. Outside, the village is dark and quiet, the fields empty, the church silent. The stars wheel overhead, indifferent to the small lives being lived beneath them, but beautiful nonetheless, eternal and unchanging in a world of constant change. The story has been told. The peasants have lived their lives and passed on to whatever awaits them. The village endures, transformed beyond recognition but still somehow itself, still a place where people live and work and love and die. And now the night is ending. The darkness begins to lift, the first faint light appearing on the eastern horizon. Soon the sun will rise and a new day will begin, full of work and worry, joy and sorrow, all the ordinary things that make up an ordinary life. But for now, in this moment between darkness and light, between sleeping and waking, there is only peace. The peace of labor completed, of stories told, of lives lived and remembered. The peace that comes at the end of all things, when the struggle is over and the rest is earned. Sleep well. Dream of quiet villages and peaceful fields, of simple lives and honest work, of all the countless people who came before you and made your life possible. Dream of the great chain of humanity of which you are a part, the endless story that began before you and will continue after you are gone. And when you wake, carry something of this story with you. Remember Thomas and Agnes. Remember the medieval peasants whose names have been forgotten. Remember that every human life has value, that every person who has ever lived has mattered. Let this knowledge shape how you see the world and how you treat the people around you. For in the end, we are all peasants, all ordinary people living ordinary lives, all links in the chain that connects the past to the future. Our names may be forgotten, our stories may be lost, but we will have been part of something larger than ourselves, something that endures beyond any individual life. This is the gift of history, the gift of story, the gift of memory. To know that we are not alone, that we are connected to all who came before and all who will come after, that our lives have meaning even if that meaning is hidden from us. The medieval peasants knew this, lived this, breathed this every day of their lives. They were part of a community, part of a tradition, part of a story much larger than themselves. And in their own way, they were content with this, found satisfaction in their place in the order of things, found meaning in the cycles of labor and rest that governed their existence. We can learn from them if we are willing to listen. We can learn to find contentment in the ordinary, meaning in the everyday, connection in the communities we build and the traditions we maintain. We can learn to see ourselves as part of something larger, to value our place in the chain of generations, to find peace in the knowledge that we are not alone. The night is nearly over now. The story has been told, the lessons have been offered, the images have been painted. All that remains is to rest, to let the mind settle and the body relax, to surrender to the sleep that comes to all living things. The village sleeps, the fields sleep, the whole world sleeps, wrapped in darkness, waiting for the dawn. And you sleep too, part of this great community of sleepers, part of the vast human family that has been sleeping and waking, living and dying for as long as there have been humans on this earth. Rest now. The work is done, the story is told. Tomorrow will bring its own concerns, its own labors, its own joys and sorrows. But tonight there is only peace, only rest, only the gentle embrace of sleep. The fire has burned down to embers. The cottage is quiet. The stars shine overhead. And somewhere in the space between memory and dream, Thomas and Agnes sleep too, resting at last from their long labors, at peace in the earth that was their home. The village church was more than a building. It was the heart of the community, the place where every significant moment of life was marked and sanctified. Here Thomas was baptized as an infant, the holy water washing away the original sin that every human inherited from Adam and Eve. Here he received his first communion as a boy, tasting for the first time the bread and wine that were the body and blood of Christ. Here he was married to Agnes, their hands joined by the priest, their vows witnessed by the entire community. The church dominated the village not only spiritually but physically. Its stone tower was the tallest structure for miles around, visible from the distant fields, a constant reminder of the faith that shaped every aspect of medieval life. The bells that hung in the tower rang out the hours of the day, called the villagers to worship, announced deaths and celebrations. Their sound was as familiar to Thomas as his own heartbeat. Inside, the church was a world apart from the humble cottages where the peasants lived. The walls were painted with scenes from the Bible, vivid images of saints and sinners, heaven and hell, designed to teach the illiterate congregation the stories of their faith. The windows, where there were windows of glass rather than simple openings, let in colored light that seemed almost miraculous. The altar was draped in cloth and adorned with vessels of silver or pewter, humble by the standards of great cathedrals but magnificent compared to anything else in the village. The priest was a central figure in village life, the representative of the vast institution of the church that connected this small community to the wider Christian world. He was not always a learned man, for many parish priests in the medieval period had little more education than their parishioners. But he could read the Latin of the services, could perform the sacraments that were essential for salvation, could provide guidance and comfort in times of trouble. Father Robert, the priest during much of Thomas's adult life, was a man of middling years and middling abilities. He had been assigned to this parish by the bishop as a young man and had never left, never risen to higher position, never distinguished himself in any particular way. But he was reliable, present when needed, patient with the struggles of his flock. He baptized babies and buried the dead, heard confessions and dispensed absolution, preached sermons that were sometimes inspiring and sometimes merely adequate. The sermons were delivered in English, not Latin, for the congregation could not understand Latin. They covered the basic teachings of the faith, the stories of Christ and the saints, the moral lessons that the church wanted its members to learn. Do not steal, do not lie, do not commit adultery, honor your parents, love your neighbor, pay your tithes. The messages were simple and repeated often so that even the dullest listener would eventually absorb them. The church calendar provided the structure for the year, a rhythm of feasts and fasts that organized time in a way that gave meaning to every season. Advent prepared for Christmas, Lent prepared for Easter, Pentecost celebrated the coming of the Holy Spirit, and countless saints' days marked the weeks and months between. Each feast had its own customs, its own foods, its own traditions that the villagers observed as their parents and grandparents had observed them. Thomas knew this calendar as well as he knew the agricultural calendar that governed his work in the fields. Indeed, the two were intertwined, the church feasts often coinciding with important moments in the farming year. The blessing of the fields in spring, the harvest Thanksgiving in autumn, the prayers for good weather and good crops, all of these connected the sacred and the secular in ways that made sense to people whose survival depended on the land. The sacraments were the channels through which divine grace flowed into human life. Baptism washed away original sin and made the infant a member of the Christian community. Confirmation strengthened the faith of the adolescent preparing to become an adult. The Eucharist, received at Mass, provided spiritual nourishment for the soul. Confession cleansed the conscience of sins committed since the last confession. Marriage sanctified the union of man and woman. Holy orders set apart those called to serve the church as priests, and the last rites prepared the dying soul for its journey to the afterlife. Thomas received all of these sacraments except holy orders, which was for those called to the priesthood. Each one marked a stage in his life, a moment of transition and transformation. Each one connected him to the larger community of Christians, living and dead, who shared the same faith and the same hope of salvation. The church taught that life on earth was a pilgrimage, a journey toward the heavenly homeland that awaited the faithful after death. The hardships of this life were temporary, tests of faith that would be rewarded in the life to come. The poor would be raised up, the humble exalted, the meek would inherit the earth. These teachings provided comfort to people whose lives were full of suffering, who had little hope of improvement in their material circumstances. But the church also taught that salvation was not guaranteed. Hell awaited those who died in a state of mortal sin, unrepentant and unabsolved. Purgatory awaited those who died with venial sins on their conscience, a period of purification before they could enter heaven. The fear of damnation was a powerful motivator, driving the faithful to confession, to penance, to the constant effort to live according to the church's teachings. Thomas felt this fear as all medieval Christians felt it. He examined his conscience regularly, confessing his sins to Father Robert, doing the penance assigned to him, trying to live a good life that would earn him a place in heaven. He was not always successful, for temptation was strong and human nature was weak. But he tried, as millions of others tried, to navigate the narrow path between salvation and damnation. The cult of the saints provided intercessors who could help with this navigation. The saints were men and women who had lived exemplary lives, who had died and been admitted to heaven, who could now intercede with God on behalf of those still struggling on earth. Each village had its patron saint, whose feast day was particularly celebrated, whose image adorned the church, whose prayers were especially sought. This village was dedicated to Saint Margaret, a virgin martyr who had suffered under the persecution of the Roman Emperor Diocletian. Her story was gruesome, involving torture and miraculous escapes, finally ending in beheading when she refused to renounce her faith. The villagers knew this story well, heard it retold every year on her feast day, took comfort from the knowledge that their patron was powerful in heaven, able to protect them from the dangers of this world. Beyond the parish church, the wider institution of the church stretched across Europe, a vast organization that owned enormous amounts of land, employed thousands of clergy, and wielded influence in every sphere of life. The Pope in Rome was the head of this institution, the vicar of Christ on earth, whose authority extended over all Christian souls. Below him were cardinals and archbishops, bishops and abbots, a hierarchy of power that reached down from the highest levels to the humblest parish priest. Thomas knew little of this hierarchy. He had never seen a bishop, never heard of most of the great ecclesiastical figures whose decisions shaped the life of the church. His experience of religion was local, centered on the parish church and its priest, on the rituals and practices that he had known since childhood. But he was aware, vaguely, that he was part of something larger, a community of faith that extended far beyond his village, that included Christians in distant lands whose names he would never know. The monasteries were another presence in medieval religious life, communities of men or women who had withdrawn from the world to devote themselves to prayer and contemplation. The nearest monastery to Thomas's village was a day's journey away, a substantial foundation that owned land in several parishes and collected tithes from hundreds of peasant families. Thomas had visited this monastery once, as a young man, accompanying his father on a journey to pay their rents to the monks who were their landlords. He had been awed by the size of the buildings, the beauty of the chapel, the quiet discipline of the monks going about their daily routines. It seemed to him a different world, a place of peace and order that contrasted sharply with the dirt and chaos of village life. The monks lived according to a rule, a set of regulations that governed every aspect of their existence. They rose in the middle of the night to sing the first prayers of the day, and they continued praying at regular intervals until they retired to their beds in the evening. Between the services, they worked, copying manuscripts, tending gardens, managing the extensive properties that supported their community. Some monasteries had become very wealthy, accumulating lands and treasures over centuries of pious donations. Others remained poor, their members living simply and devoutly, true to the ideals of their founders. But all of them represented an alternative to the ordinary life of the peasant, a path that a young man might choose if he felt called to serve God in this special way. Thomas had never felt such a calling. His vocation was to work the land, to raise a family, to live the ordinary life that his parents had lived before him. But he respected those who chose the monastic path, believed that their prayers benefited the whole Christian community, and hoped that their intercessions might help his own soul on its journey to heaven. The manor was the secular counterpart to the church, the center of economic and political power in the village. Here lived the lord, or more often his representative, for many lords owned multiple manors and could not be present at all of them. Here was the great hall where justice was dispensed, the barns and storehouses where the lord's share of the harvest was kept, the workshops where essential goods were produced. The relationship between peasant and lord was complex, a mixture of obligation and protection, exploitation and mutual dependence. The lord owned the land, or held it from some greater lord who held it from the king. The peasants worked the land, owing a portion of their labor and their produce to the lord in exchange for the right to cultivate their strips and live in their cottages. The terms of this arrangement varied enormously from place to place and changed over time. Some peasants were free, able to leave the manor if they wished, owing only rent and specific services to the lord. Others were serfs, bound to the land, unable to leave without the lord's permission, required to work a certain number of days each week on the lord's domain in addition to their own holdings. Thomas was somewhere in between these extremes. His family had held their strips for as long as anyone could remember, and the obligations they owed were fixed by custom and recorded in the manor rolls. He owed labor service during the busiest times of the agricultural year, plowing and harvesting on the Lord's fields before he could attend to his own. He owed a portion of his grain at harvest time, a certain number of chickens and eggs at specified points during the year, fees when his children married or when he inherited land. In exchange, he had security. The Lord was obligated to protect him from external threats, to maintain the infrastructure of the manor, to provide justice through the manor court. The relationship was not equal, but it was reciprocal, a web of duties and rights that bound both parties together. The lord of this manor was Sir William, a knight who held several manors in the region and owed military service to the earl, who was his overlord. Sir William was not often present, preferring to spend his time at his larger holdings or at the court of the earl where advancement might be won. But he visited occasionally, riding through the village with his retinue, inspecting the fields and the accounts, reminding the peasants of his authority. The day-to-day management of the manor was left to the steward, a man named Richard who had held this position for many years. Richard was a hard man, but not an unjust one, demanding the full measure of what was owed but not taking more than custom allowed. He collected the rents and the fines, supervised the labor services, kept the records that documented everything. Thomas had dealt with Richard many times over the years, reporting for his labor service, paying his dues, appearing before the manor court to settle disputes. He did not like Richard, for no peasant truly liked the man who enforced the Lord's claims. But he respected him, recognized that Richard was doing his job as best he could, and accepted that the system required such men to function. The manor court met several times a year to handle the business of the community. Here disputes were settled, transfers of land were recorded, fines were assessed for violations of the customs and rules that governed village life. The court was presided over by the steward, but the judgments were often made by a jury of peasants, men who knew the customs and could apply them fairly. Thomas had served on this jury several times, had listened to arguments about boundary lines and grazing rights, had helped decide cases of theft and assault, had witnessed the punishments meted out to those found guilty. The system was not always fair, for power inevitably tilted the scales, but it provided a forum for resolving conflicts, a way of maintaining order without constant recourse to violence. The obligations of the peasants to the lord were burdensome, but they were not unlimited. Custom protected the peasants from arbitrary exactions, and any lord who tried to increase the burdens faced resistance. The peasants might not have weapons, but they could refuse to work, could appeal to higher authority, could make the lord's life difficult in countless small ways. The relationship was a negotiation, even if one party had far more power than the other. Beyond the lord, there were other authorities whose reach extended into village life. The king, far away in his capital, was the source of all law and the ultimate guarantor of peace. The sheriff, the king's representative in the shire, enforced royal justice and collected royal taxes. The church had its own courts for certain matters, particularly those involving morals and marriages. Thomas rarely encountered these higher authorities directly. His life was lived within the bounds of the village and the manor, and the disputes and decisions that affected him were handled at that level. But he was aware that he was part of a larger kingdom, that there were powers above the Lord whose commands even the Lord must obey. The king was an almost mythical figure to Thomas, known through stories and proclamations but never seen in person. The current king, whoever he might be at any given moment in Thomas's long life, was a distant presence. His wars and his taxes felt, but his person never glimpsed. The peasants paid their share of the royal taxes, prayed for the king in church, and otherwise went about their business without much thought for the great affairs of state. The village itself was a community in the fullest sense, a group of people bound together by geography and necessity, by kinship and custom, by shared labor and shared celebration. Everyone knew everyone else, knew their families back several generations, knew their strengths and weaknesses, their virtues and their vices. This intimacy had its benefits and its costs. In times of trouble, the community rallied together, helping families who had suffered losses, sharing resources when some had more and others had less. In times of plenty, the community celebrated together, the feasts and festivals that punctuated the year occasions for gathering and rejoicing. But the intimacy also meant that privacy was almost impossible. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and gossip spread faster than fire. Conflicts that might have been easily resolved in a larger, more anonymous community festered and grew, nurtured by the constant contact that village life required. Feuds between families could last for generations, the original cause forgotten but the animosity preserved. Thomas had his own feuds, small and large, accumulated over a lifetime of living in close proximity to the same people. A dispute over a boundary line with one neighbor, never fully resolved, had left a residue of bad feeling that colored every subsequent interaction. A perceived slight from another family, decades in the past, was remembered and resented long after the original parties had died. But he also had his alliances, his friends and kinsmen whose support he could rely on, whose company he enjoyed, whose welfare he cared about as much as his own. The family of his wife Agnes had become his own family, their relatives his relatives, their friends his friends. The bonds of marriage extended outward, connecting one household to another in webs of obligation and affection. The community had its own governance, informal but real. There was no mayor or village council in any formal sense, but there were men whose opinions carried weight, whose approval was sought before any major decision was made. Thomas had become one of these men as he aged, his experience and judgment respected by the younger members of the community. The village also had its outcasts, people who had violated the norms so severely that they were excluded from full participation in community life. A woman accused of witchcraft, never formally tried but forever after viewed with suspicion. A man who had cheated his neighbors one too many times, whose word was no longer trusted, who found himself isolated even while living among people he had known all his life. Thomas had seen how these outcasts lived, on the margins of the community, tolerated but not welcomed, their isolation a punishment more severe than any official sanction. He had tried to avoid such a fate to maintain his reputation, to be known as an honest man whose word could be trusted. It was not always easy, for life presented temptations and occasions for dishonesty. But the consequences of losing one's place in the community were severe enough to keep most people honest most of the time. The young people of the village formed their own community within the community, their own friendships and rivalries, their own customs and entertainments. They worked alongside their parents from an early age, but they also found time for play, for the games and sports that children everywhere enjoy. Thomas could remember his own childhood, though the memories had grown hazy with age. Running through the stubble fields after harvest, playing with balls made of stuffed leather, swimming in the stream on hot summer days. The work was hard even for children, but there were moments of freedom, moments of pure joy that stayed with him across the decades. The transition from childhood to adulthood was gradual, marked not by a single event but by a series of increasing responsibilities. A boy began to help with lighter tasks, gradually taking on heavier work as his body grew strong enough to handle it. A girl helped with the household and the garden, learning the skills she would need as a wife and mother. By the time they reached their mid-teens, most young people were doing nearly as much work as their parents. Marriage marked the final transition to adulthood. It was expected that everyone would marry, that every young man would find a wife, and every young woman would find a husband. The unmarried were anomalies, objects of curiosity or pity, pressured by family and community to find a partner and settle down. Thomas had married Agnes when he was 20 and she was 17, ages that were typical for the time. Their marriage was arranged by their families, though both had some say in the matter and neither objected. Love was not the primary consideration, though it might develop over time. More important was the practical question of whether the match made sense, whether the two families were compatible, whether the young couple could establish a viable household. They had made it work, Thomas and Agnes, as most couples made it work. There were hard times, as there were in every marriage, conflicts and disappointments and moments of anger. But there was also companionship, the comfort of having someone to share the burdens and the joys, the partnership that grew stronger over years and decades of living together. Let us walk now through the village as it wakes on a summer morning, seeing the sights and sounds that Thomas would have known, experiencing something of the texture of daily life in this vanished world. The dawn comes early at this time of year, the sky lightening while most people are still asleep. The first to stir are the roosters, their crowing echoing from cottage to cottage, announcing the day with a sound that has changed little in thousands of years. The hens cluck and rustle in their coops, awaiting release to scratch and peck in the yards. Smoke begins to rise from the cottages as fires are kindled, thin gray plumes climbing into the still morning air. The smell of burning wood mingles with the other smells of the village, the animals and the gardens, the earth and the vegetation, creating an atmosphere that would be overwhelming to modern senses but barely noticed by those who lived within it. The women are the first to emerge, stepping out to fetch water from the well or the stream, beginning the daily tasks that never end. They wear simple dresses of undyed wool or linen, their hair covered by cloths or wimples, their feet bare or shod in rough leather shoes. They greet each other as they pass, exchanging words about the weather, about their families, about the work ahead. The men follow, heading toward the fields or the workshops, their tools over their shoulders or in their hands. They too wear simple clothes, tunics and breeches, belted at the waist, practical garments designed for labor rather than display. Their faces are weathered by sun and wind, their hands calloused by years of work. The children appear last, rubbing sleep from their eyes, joining their parents in the yard or being sent on errands. Even the youngest have tasks to perform, fetching and carrying, watching over animals, helping with whatever needs to be done. The village has no concept of childhood as a protected period of play and learning. Children are small adults, expected to contribute as soon as they are able. The church bell rings, calling the faithful to morning prayers. Not everyone attends, for the demands of work are pressing, but some make their way to the church, kneeling briefly before the altar, murmuring the familiar words, seeking blessing for the day ahead. Father Robert is there, leading the prayers, his voice echoing in the mostly empty building. The market is held in the open space near the church, on days when there are goods to sell and buyers to purchase them. Today is not a market day, but there is still some trading happening, neighbors exchanging vegetables or eggs, settling debts, arranging for the loan of tools or animals. The economy of the village is largely based on such informal exchanges, with money playing a smaller role than it does in the towns. The blacksmith is at work in his forge, the clang of his hammer ringing out over the other sounds of the morning. He is making nails today, dozens of them, essential items that hold together the buildings and the tools that the village depends upon. His forge is the only source of fire hot enough to work iron, and his skills are essential to the community. The miller is at the mill, supervising the grinding of grain that families have brought for processing. The mill is owned by the Lord, and every villager is required to use it, paying a fee for the service. This monopoly is resented, but there is no alternative, for no one else has the capital to build and maintain such a complex piece of equipment. The children who are old enough to work but not yet needed in the fields are gathered with their elders, learning the skills they will need as adults. The boys practice with tools, clumsily at first, growing more confident with repetition. The girls learn to spin and sew, to cook and preserve, the domestic arts that will be their responsibility for the rest of their lives. The morning passes in work, steady and unrelenting, broken only by brief pauses for rest or refreshment. The sun climbs higher, the day grows warmer, and the village hums with the sound of productive activity. There is no distinction between workday and weekend, no concept of leisure time as something separate from the demands of survival. At midday, the work pauses for the main meal of the day. Families gather in their cottages or in the shade of trees, eating the bread and pottage that make up the bulk of the peasant diet. The food is simple but nourishing, fuel for bodies that will work until the light fails, and then work some more by firelight. The afternoon continues as the morning did, more of the same tasks, the slow accumulation of labor that builds toward harvest, toward survival, toward another year of life. The shadows lengthen, the sun sinks toward the western hills, and the pace of work gradually slows as fatigue sets in. Evening brings a change of activity but not an end to work. The outdoor tasks give way to indoor ones, the heavy labor to the lighter work of spinning and mending, of preparing for tomorrow, of doing the countless small things that keep a household running. The family gathers around the hearth, the fire providing light and warmth, the center around which their lives revolve. Supper is eaten, prayers are said, and one by one the family members retire to their beds. The fire burns low, the cottage grows quiet, and another day in the medieval village comes to its end. Tomorrow will bring more of the same, and the day after, and the day after that, the rhythm of life continuing until it finally stops. The seasons turn as they have always turned, as they will always turn. Spring gives way to summer, summer to autumn, autumn to winter, and winter to spring again. The cycle is eternal, or seems so to those who live within it, a pattern as reliable as the rising and setting of the sun. Thomas grew old within this cycle, marking the years by the harvests he gathered, the children he raised, the changes he witnessed in the village he had known all his life. He saw neighbors born and neighbors die, saw fields change hands and cottages rebuilt, saw the slow transformation that occurs when time works its will on human communities. He saw changes in the wider world as well, though these came to him as rumors and reports rather than direct experience. Wars were fought in distant places, kings rose and fell. The great affairs of state played out far from the quiet village where he lived. Some of these events touched the village directly, in the form of taxes or levies, but most passed by without leaving much trace. The church, too, was changing, though the changes came slowly and were not always visible at the parish level. New religious orders were founded, old ones reformed. The machinery of salvation constantly adjusted and improved. The great debates that occupied the theologians in their universities filtered down to the village as simplified teachings, new saints to venerate, new feasts to celebrate. Thomas accepted these changes as he accepted everything else, with the patience of one who knows that the world is not his to command. He had his opinions, voiced them when asked, but he did not expect those opinions to matter much in the grand scheme of things. His task was to live his life as best he could, to fulfill his obligations, to save his soul, and to leave something behind for those who came after. The children were that legacy, the most important thing he would leave behind. John was well established now, running the family's strips as Thomas had run them, passing on the knowledge and skills that Thomas had passed to him. The grandchildren were growing up, learning the same lessons, preparing to take their places in the endless chain of generations. Agnes had been his partner in building this legacy, and her loss, when it came, left a void that could not be filled. They had been married for nearly 40 years, had shared everything that marriage entailed, had grown old together as they had grown young together. Her death was not unexpected, for she had been ill for some time, but it was still a blow, a reminder that his own time was limited. He lived on for a few more years after her death, cared for by his children, respected by the community, waiting for the end that he knew was coming. He was not afraid, for he had lived a good life and made his peace with God. But he was tired, weary in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, ready for the rest that awaited. When death came for him, it came gently as it had come for Agnes. He slipped away in his sleep, his breath slowing and stopping, his spirit departing for whatever awaited it. The family mourned him, buried him beside Agnes in the churchyard, and then returned to the work of living, for the work never stopped, not even for death. The village continued, as it had always continued, one generation succeeding another, the patterns of life repeating with small variations across the centuries. Thomas became a memory, then a name in family stories, then nothing at all, absorbed into the anonymous mass of ancestors who had lived and died in this place. But his legacy endured in ways that could not be traced or measured. The children he had raised, the fields he had tilled, the contributions he had made to the life of the community, all of these persisted in some form, influencing the future in ways that no one could calculate. He was a link in the chain, and the chain continued after him, stretching forward toward times he could not imagine. The world beyond the village was vast, and largely unknown to those who lived within it. Thomas had traveled no more than 20 miles from his birthplace in his entire life, and most of his neighbors had traveled even less. The great cities, London and Paris and Rome, were names heard in stories, places as distant and unreal as the Jerusalem of the Bible or the Camelot of legend. Yet the village was not entirely isolated. Traders passed through occasionally, bringing goods from distant places and news of the wider world. Pilgrims traveled the roads, journeying to shrines where miracles were said to occur. Soldiers marched to wars, and sometimes those wars came close enough that refugees fled through the village, bringing tales of destruction and displacement. The king's messengers rode through from time to time, carrying proclamations that were read out in the church, announcing new taxes or new laws or the outcomes of battles fought in the king's name. These proclamations were listened to with varying degrees of interest, for most of what happened in the great world had little direct impact on the daily lives of the peasants. But sometimes the great world did intrude. When the king needed money for his wars, the taxes increased, and the peasants felt the burden. When armies marched through the countryside, they took what they needed, whether the peasants were willing to give or not. When the plague swept across the land, it did not spare the villages, and the dead accumulated in the churchyards just as they did in the cities. Thomas had seen soldiers once, a column of armed men marching along the road that passed near the village, their banners flying, their weapons glinting in the sun. He had watched from a safe distance, fascinated and frightened, aware that these men represented a power that could crush his entire village without effort. They had passed by without stopping, bound for some conflict that Thomas never learned the outcome of, but the memory stayed with him, a reminder of the violence that lurked beneath the surface of the medieval world. The church provided the main connection between the village and the wider world. The priest received instructions from the bishop, who received instructions from the archbishop, who received instructions from the Pope in Rome. Through this chain of authority, the decisions made in distant councils and conclaves filtered down to the parish level, shaping the rituals and teachings that governed village religious life. The great events of church history were known in the village, though often in garbled or simplified form. The Crusades had been preached from the pulpit, and a few young men from the region had actually gone, though none had returned. The conflicts between popes and emperors were mentioned in sermons, though the details were vague and the relevance unclear. The building of the great cathedrals was spoken of with wonder, though no one in the village had ever seen one. These connections to the wider world were thin and intermittent, but they were real. The village was not a completely closed system, not entirely cut off from the currents of history that were reshaping Europe. It was a backwater, certainly, a place where change came slowly, and traditions persisted long after they had been abandoned elsewhere. But it was part of something larger, connected by threads of commerce and religion, law and custom, to the civilization of which it was a small but genuine part. The animals of the village were partners in the work of survival, essential to the agricultural system that sustained human life. The oxen that pulled the plow, the cows that provided milk, the pigs that provided meat, the chickens that provided eggs, all of these were as much a part of the village as the human inhabitants. The relationship between peasants and animals was practical rather than sentimental. Animals were valued for what they could provide, and when they could no longer provide it, they were slaughtered without ceremony. There was no room for pets in a world where every mouth had to be fed and every creature had to earn its keep. Yet there was also a kind of intimacy that came from living in such close quarters with animals, sharing the same space, depending on each other for survival. Thomas knew his animals as individuals, recognized their temperaments and their quirks, spoke to them as he worked with them in the fields. They were not friends, exactly, but they were companions, fellow laborers in the endless task of wresting a living from the land. The cow was the most valuable animal the family owned, a source of milk that could be drunk fresh or made into cheese, a potential source of meat when she was too old to produce milk, a beast of burden that could pull a cart or help with light plowing. She was kept in the cottage during the winter months, her body heat helping to warm the dwelling, her presence a constant in the daily routine. The pig was fattened through the year on scraps and forage, then slaughtered at Martinmas when the cold weather made it possible to preserve the meat. The killing of the pig was a significant event, a day of hard work and, in its way, celebration. Every part of the animal was used, the meat salted or smoked, the blood made into puddings, the fat rendered into lard, the intestines cleaned and used as sausage casings. The chickens scratched in the yard, producing eggs that supplemented the family's diet, occasionally providing meat when a bird grew old or a rooster was surplus to requirements. They required little care and provided much in return, a good bargain by the standards of the time. Other animals inhabited the village and its surroundings, wild creatures that the peasants encountered in their daily lives. Deer and rabbits lived in the woods, tempting targets for poachers who risked severe punishment if caught taking the Lord's game. Birds of every kind filled the air, some hunted for food, others simply present as part of the natural world. Dogs served as guards and hunters, their barking alerting the village to the approach of strangers, their noses useful for tracking game. Cats kept down the mice and rats that would otherwise have eaten the stored grain. These animals were working creatures, valued for their usefulness, but they also provided companionship, a presence that made the cottage feel less lonely on long winter nights. The sounds of the medieval village were different from the sounds we know today. There was no hum of electricity, no roar of engines, no constant background noise of machinery. The sounds were natural and human, the voices of people and animals, the rustle of wind and water, the rhythms of work and rest. The church bells marked the hours, ringing at set times throughout the day, their sound carrying across the fields and into the cottages. The bells called the faithful to prayer, announced deaths and celebrations, warned of danger when it threatened. Their sound was the most regular and reliable marker of time in a world without clocks. The animals added their voices to the soundscape, the lowing of cattle, the grunting of pigs, the clucking of chickens, the crowing of roosters. Dogs barked, cats meowed, horses whinnied when there were horses. The sounds of animals were constant and familiar, so much a part of daily life that they were barely noticed. Human sounds filled the village as well, voices raised in conversation or argument, in song or prayer. The ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the splash of water at the well, the creak of wagon wheels on rutted roads. Children laughing and crying, mothers calling, fathers giving instructions. The sounds of a community going about its business, alive with the noise of human activity. At night, the sounds changed. The human voices fell silent, the work stopped, the village settled into sleep. The sounds that remained were the sounds of the natural world, the hooting of owls, the rustling of nocturnal creatures, the whisper of wind through the trees. Sometimes in the distance, the howling of wolves, a reminder that the wild world was never far away. These sounds formed the backdrop of Thomas's life, so constant and familiar that he rarely noticed them consciously. But they shaped his experience of the world, created the atmosphere in which he lived and worked, provided the rhythm that organized his days. When he was away from the village, in the rare occasions when he traveled to the market town or visited relatives in another parish, the different sounds were disorienting, a reminder of how much his identity was tied to the particular place where he had been born. The smells of the medieval village were intense by modern standards, a mixture of natural and human odors that would overwhelm contemporary sensibilities. The absence of plumbing and the presence of animals, the smoke from cooking fires and the waste from daily life, all of these created an olfactory environment that was rich and powerful. The cottage itself smelled of smoke and animals, of the straw that covered the floor and the bodies of the people who slept within. The cooking smells were added daily, the pottage bubbling over the fire, the bread baking in the oven, the ale brewing in its barrel. These smells were not unpleasant to those who lived with them, but they were strong and pervasive. Outside, the smells of the farmyard dominated, the manure of cattle and pigs, the hay and straw that fed and bedded the animals, the earthy smell of the soil itself. The seasons brought their own smells, the fresh greenness of spring, the dusty warmth of summer, the decay of autumn, the clean cold of winter. Thomas knew these smells as intimately as he knew any aspect of his world. He could tell by smell whether the ale was ready, whether the meat was fresh, whether rain was coming. His nose was a tool, providing information that was essential for the work of daily life. The idea that smells should be eliminated or masked, that cleanliness required the absence of natural odors, would have seemed strange to him. The texture of medieval life was rough, the surfaces that people touched and the clothes they wore, the tools they used and the food they ate. Smoothness was rare and expensive, the product of labor and skill that most could not afford. Roughness was the norm, accepted without complaint as simply the way things were. The clothes were coarse, the wool scratchy against the skin, the linen stiff and heavy. There was no softness in the garments of the poor, no comfort in the materials that covered their bodies. But the clothes were warm and durable, which was what mattered, and the discomfort was so constant that it ceased to be noticed. The food had its own textures, the chewy density of dark bread, the thickness of the pottage, the occasional hardness of grit in the flour that wore down teeth over time. Eating was a physical activity, requiring effort and attention, nothing like the effortless consumption of modern processed foods. The tools were rough-hewn and functional, shaped by use rather than aesthetics, their handles worn smooth by countless hours of gripping. The hoe and the sickle, the flail and the rake, all bore the marks of the hands that had wielded them, their surfaces shaped by the friction of human labor. Thomas's own hands were rough and calloused, hardened by decades of work, capable of gripping tools and handling materials that would tear softer skin. His hands were the primary interface between himself and his world, the means by which he transformed the raw material of the land into the sustenance his family needed. They bore the scars of injuries, the marks of age, the permanent darkening of skin that never quite came clean. The light of the medieval village was natural light, sunlight during the day and firelight at night, with nothing in between. The absence of artificial illumination shaped the rhythm of life, confining activity to the daylight hours, or to the small circle of warmth and visibility that a fire could provide. The days were long in summer, short in winter, and the work expanded or contracted to fill the available light. In June, Thomas might work from before dawn until after dusk, 14 or 15 hours of daylight filled with labor. In December, the working day shrank to 8 hours or less, with long evenings spent by the fire, waiting for the morning. Firelight was precious, the only defense against the darkness that otherwise enveloped the world. The fire in the cottage hearth served multiple purposes: cooking food, warming bodies, providing light for the tasks that had to be done after the sun went down. It was tended carefully, never allowed to go completely out, the most important piece of technology the family possessed. Candles and oil lamps existed but were expensive. luxuries that most peasants could not afford. The wealthy might illuminate their homes with dozens of candles, turning night into a reasonable facsimile of day. The poor made do with firelight, and when the fire burned low, they went to bed. The darkness of medieval nights was absolute in a way that modern people rarely experience. Without electric lights, without even the glow of distant cities, the nights were truly dark, lit only by the stars and the moon when they were visible. This darkness was not merely an inconvenience but a feature of the world, a daily reminder of human limitations, a time when the creatures of the night held sway. Thomas was not afraid of the dark, for he had lived with it all his life, but he respected it. The dark was when accidents happened, when predators hunted, when the spirits and demons of popular belief were most active. The light of the fire was a sanctuary, a circle of safety in a world that could be dangerous. And when the fire died, sleep was the only sensible response. The passage of time in the medieval village was marked differently than we mark it today. There were no clocks, no precise measurements of hours and minutes, no schedules that divided the day into equal segments. Time was fluid, measured by the position of the sun, the ringing of church bells, the rhythm of work and rest. The day began at dawn and ended at dusk, its length varying with the seasons. The church divided the day into canonical hours, times for prayer that corresponded roughly to 3-hour intervals, but these were observed mainly by the clergy. For the peasants, time was measured by tasks, by the work that had to be done and the daylight available to do it. The week was marked by Sunday, the day of rest when work in the fields was forbidden and attendance at church was expected. The other days blended together, one much like another, distinguished only by the particular tasks that each required. There were no weekends in the modern sense, no clear division between work time and leisure time. The year was marked by the agricultural calendar and the church calendar, the two intertwined so tightly that they seemed like one. The seasons determined what work was needed. The church feasts provided moments of rest and celebration. Together, they created a rhythm that organized time in ways that felt natural and inevitable. Thomas experienced time as his ancestors had experienced it, as his descendants would experience it for centuries to come. The modern obsession with punctuality, with precise scheduling, with the quantification of time, would have seemed strange and unnecessary to him. Time was not a commodity to be measured and spent, but a medium in which life unfolded, a river that carried everyone forward at the same pace. May the peace of those quiet villages be yours. May you find rest as they found rest after the labors of your day. And may you wake refreshed, ready to take your place in the great chain of humanity, to live your life and tell your story and pass on whatever you have learned to those who come after. The fire burns low. The village sleeps. The stars turn overhead, marking the passage of hours that no clock measures. In the cottages, the families lie together, breathing slowly, dreaming dreams that will be forgotten by morning. Thomas sleeps and Agnes sleeps beside him, and their children sleep nearby, and their animals sleep in the far end of the cottage. The whole village sleeps, wrapped in darkness, waiting for the dawn that will bring another day of work and another night of rest. This is the rhythm of peasant life, the endless alternation of labor and sleep, of waking and resting, of effort and recovery. It is a rhythm as old as humanity itself, the fundamental pattern that underlies all the complexities of civilization. And now that rhythm claims you too. The story has been told, the images have been painted, the world of the medieval peasant has been briefly illuminated. What remains is rest, the sleep that comes at the end of the day, the peace that follows effort. Close your eyes. Let your breathing slow. Feel the weight of your body settling into whatever surface supports it. The concerns of the day are fading. The thoughts are quieting. The transition from waking to sleeping is beginning. The medieval peasants made this transition every night, surrendering consciousness to the darkness, trusting that morning would come and life would continue. They did not fear sleep, for sleep was a gift, a respite from labor, a small death that rehearsed the larger death that awaited everyone. Let sleep come now as it came to them, as it comes to all living things. The story is over, but the peace it offered continues, available to anyone who accepts it, a gift from the past to the present. The night holds you. The silence surrounds you. The rest you need is here. The wisdom of the medieval peasant was not found in books, for most could not read, but in the accumulated experience of generations. It was practical wisdom, knowledge of how to survive in a world that offered no guarantees, how to wrest a living from the land, how to navigate the social relationships that made community possible. This wisdom was passed down through observation and imitation, through stories told around the fire, through the slow absorption of skills and knowledge that occurred when children worked alongside their parents. There were no schools for the children of peasants, no formal education in the modern sense. Learning happened in the course of daily life, embedded in the work itself. Thomas had learned everything he knew from his father and his neighbors, from the older men who had been farming these fields when he was still a child. He had learned when to plant and when to harvest, how to read the weather and how to care for animals, what the customs of the manor required and what the church expected. This knowledge was not systematic or theoretical, but it was sufficient for the life he was living. He passed this knowledge on to his own children, teaching them as he had been taught, preparing them for lives that would be much like his own. The continuity between generations was almost complete, the son doing what the father had done, the daughter doing what the mother had done, the patterns of life repeating with only minor variations. This continuity was both a strength and a limitation. It preserved what worked, ensured that hard-won knowledge was not lost, provided stability in a world where change could be dangerous. But it also resisted innovation, made it difficult to adopt new methods or new ideas, kept people locked into patterns that might no longer serve them well. The medieval peasant lived in a world that was largely static, where the expectation was that tomorrow would be much like today, where the future was imagined as a continuation of the present rather than a departure from it. This was not stupidity or lack of imagination, but a reasonable response to circumstances. In a world without safety nets, without insurance, without the possibility of starting over if things went wrong, caution was wisdom. The dreams of the medieval peasant were not so different from our own dreams. They dreamed of food when they were hungry, of warmth when they were cold, of rest when they were tired. They dreamed of their families and their neighbors, of the places they knew and the tasks they performed. They dreamed the universal dreams of humanity, shaped by the particulars of their circumstances but recognizable across the centuries. Thomas dreamed, as everyone dreams, though he rarely remembered his dreams upon waking. Sometimes fragments stayed with him, images that seemed significant though their meaning was unclear. A field of golden grain that stretched to the horizon, a face that he knew but could not name, a journey that led somewhere important but never arrived. The church taught that dreams could be messages from God or temptations from the devil, and this teaching influenced how dreams were interpreted. A dream of abundance might be a promise of divine favor, or it might be a temptation to the sin of greed. A dream of disaster might be a warning to repent, or it might be a test of faith. The meaning was never certain, and the wise person did not place too much weight on dreams. But dreams were also simply dreams, the nightly processing of experience, the mind's way of consolidating memories and working through problems. Thomas did not need a theological explanation for his dreams. He simply dreamed, as humans have always dreamed, and woke to face another day. The hopes of the medieval peasant were modest by modern standards, focused on survival rather than advancement, on getting through the year rather than getting ahead. The hope was for a good harvest, for healthy children, for freedom from war and disease, for the ordinary blessings that could not be taken for granted. Thomas hoped that his children would have good lives, that they would find spouses and establish households, that they would have children of their own to carry the family forward. He hoped that the Lord would be fair and the weather would be favorable, that the taxes would not increase and the harvest would not fail. These were the hopes of a realistic man, calibrated to what was possible rather than what was desired. He did not hope for wealth or fame, for advancement in the social hierarchy, for any of the things that modern ambition typically pursues. Such hopes would have seemed foolish, a waste of mental energy on impossibilities. The social order was fixed, or appeared to be, and a peasant's son would be a peasant, as his father had been before him. But Thomas did hope for salvation, for the eternal life that the church promised to the faithful. This hope was perhaps the most important of all, the one that gave meaning to the hardships of this life, the one that made the struggle worthwhile. If this world was merely a prelude to the next, then its difficulties could be borne, and its pleasures could be enjoyed without guilt. The fears of the medieval peasant were many and real. Fear of hunger, when the harvest failed and the stores ran out. Fear of disease, when plague swept through the village and claimed the young and the strong along with the old and the weak. Fear of violence, when soldiers marched through or outlaws preyed upon travelers. Fear of damnation, when sins accumulated and confession seemed inadequate. Thomas carried these fears with him, as everyone carried them, a background anxiety that never entirely disappeared. He had seen hunger, had buried children who died of disease, had heard stories of violence that kept him watchful on the roads. He knew that disaster could strike at any time, that the security he enjoyed was fragile, that forces beyond his control could destroy everything he had built. But he did not let these fears paralyze him. He worked and planned, took precautions where he could, trusted in God for what he could not control. Fear was a constant companion, but it was not the master. Life went on, work was done, and most days were ordinary, unremarkable, neither disastrous nor triumphant. The greatest fear, perhaps, was the fear of dying unconfessed, of leaving this world with sins unforgiven, of facing judgment with a stained soul. This fear drove people to the priest, to the confessional, to the rituals of penance that promised absolution. It was a fear that the church cultivated, for it kept the faithful obedient, but it was also a genuine fear, rooted in belief, experienced as real and urgent. Thomas made his confessions regularly, examined his conscience, tried to die at peace with God. Whether he succeeded, whether he found the salvation he sought, is beyond our knowledge. The records do not tell us, and faith provides no certainty. All we know is that he lived, and that he died, and that his life mattered to those who shared it with him. The love of the medieval peasant was as real as any love, though it was expressed differently than we express it today. Love between husband and wife, between parent and child, between neighbors and friends, all of these bonds existed and mattered. gave meaning to lives that might otherwise have seemed merely hard. Thomas loved Agnes, though he would not have used that word in quite the way we use it. Their marriage had been arranged, but that did not mean it was loveless. Over the years of living together, working together, raising children together, a bond had formed that was deeper than romantic passion, more durable than youthful infatuation. It was the love of familiarity, of shared struggle, of two lives woven so tightly together that separation was unthinkable. He loved his children with the fierce protective love of a parent, worried about them, worked for them, wanted the best for them that his limited circumstances could provide. He loved his grandchildren with the gentler love of age, enjoying their presence without bearing the full weight of responsibility for their welfare. He loved his village in a way, the place where he had been born and where he would die, the landscape that he knew more intimately than he knew anything else. The fields and the stream, the church and the cottages, the faces of neighbors he had known all his life, all of these were woven into his identity, part of who he was. Love in the medieval village was not often spoken, not celebrated in poetry or song as it was among the nobility. But it was present, binding people together, giving them reasons to continue, making the hardships bearable and the joys meaningful. And so we come to the end of this story, this glimpse into a world that is gone but not entirely forgotten. The medieval peasants have been dead for centuries, their names lost, their faces unknown, their individual stories absorbed into the general history of humanity. But they lived, and their lives mattered, and in some small way, we are their heirs. The cottages they built have crumbled to dust. The fields they tilled have been transformed by centuries of change. The church where they worshipped may still stand, or may have been replaced by newer structures, or may have fallen into ruin. The physical traces of their existence are largely gone, erased by time, but something remains. The land they worked still produces food. The communities they built still exist in some form. The traditions they followed have been transformed but not entirely abandoned. The chain of generations that began with them stretches forward to us and will stretch forward beyond us. We are connected to them, whether we know it or not. Their genes may flow in our blood if we are descended from the peoples who lived in those medieval villages. Their cultural innovations, however humble, may have contributed to the civilization we have inherited. Their struggles and their triumphs, their failures and their successes, all played some part in creating the world we live in now. To remember them is to acknowledge this connection, to recognize that we did not create ourselves, that we stand on the shoulders of countless generations who came before. It is an act of humility and also an act of gratitude, a way of honoring those who made our existence possible. The fire has burned to ash. The cottage is dark. The village sleeps beneath the stars that have watched over it for 1,000 years. And you sleep too, or soon will, joining the great community of sleepers that spans the ages. May your sleep be peaceful. May your dreams be kind. May you wake refreshed, ready to live another day, to add your own small contribution to the great human story. The medieval peasants would wish you well if they could. They knew the value of rest, the sweetness of sleep after a day of hard work. They knew that tomorrow would bring its own challenges, and that rest was necessary to face them. Accept their blessing across the centuries. Accept the peace of the night, the gift of sleep, the rest that all living things require. The story is told. The night is here. The time for sleep has come. In the centuries after Thomas and Agnes lived and died, the world they knew was transformed beyond recognition. The feudal system that had organized their lives slowly dissolved. replaced by new arrangements of labor and land. The church that had provided the framework of their faith was shaken by Reformation and Counter-Reformation, its universal authority challenged and fragmented. The quiet isolation of the village was broken by roads and railroads, by newspapers and telegraphs, by all the technologies that connected distant places and made the world smaller. The descendants of those medieval peasants became something else: farmers and factory workers, merchants and soldiers, immigrants who crossed oceans to find new homes in new lands. They spread across the globe, carrying with them some faint trace of the villages where their ancestors had lived, some echo of the rhythms and traditions that had shaped so many generations. The agricultural revolution transformed farming, making it possible to produce far more food with far fewer workers. The Industrial Revolution drew people from the countryside to the cities, creating new forms of work and new ways of life. The political revolutions overthrew the old hierarchies, replacing kings and lords with presidents and parliaments. The world that Thomas knew would be unrecognizable to his descendants of a few centuries later. Yet something persisted through all these changes. The human needs that the medieval village had met, the needs for food and shelter, for community and meaning, for love and belonging, these needs remained and remain still. We satisfy them differently than Thomas satisfied them, but we satisfy the same needs, and in that sense we are not so different from him. The family that Thomas and Agnes created continued after them, branching and spreading, intermarrying with other families, contributing their genetic heritage to an ever-widening pool. Some of their descendants prospered, rising in the social hierarchy that their ancestors could never have escaped. Others struggled, facing hardships as severe as any Thomas had known. Most lived ordinary lives, unremarkable and unrecorded, links in the great chain that stretches from the distant past into the unknowable future. We cannot trace this descent, cannot identify the specific individuals who carry Thomas's blood in their veins. The records do not exist, and even if they did, the task would be impossible. But we know that the chain is unbroken, that the generations have continued, that somewhere in the world today there are people who are connected to Thomas and Agnes by an unbroken line of parent and child. This is a kind of immortality, the only kind that most people ever achieve. Not the immortality of fame, of having one's name remembered by strangers, but the immortality of descent, of having contributed to the ongoing stream of human life. Thomas did not know the names of his descendants, could not imagine the lives they would live, but he lives on through them, his genes and his influence persisting in ways that can never be fully measured. The village that Thomas knew may still exist, though transformed almost beyond recognition. The cottage where he lived has long since crumbled, replaced by other structures that have themselves been replaced. The church may still stand, its stone walls enduring where the wooden cottages have not, a testament to the faith that built it. If you could visit that place today, you would find little that Thomas would recognize. The fields are different, enclosed and mechanized, worked by machines rather than men. The roads are paved, carrying vehicles that would seem like magic to medieval eyes. The people dress differently, speak differently, live lives that are shaped by technologies and institutions that Thomas could not have imagined. But something remains. The landscape itself, the hills and valleys, the streams and woods, these endure beneath the changes that human activity has wrought. The church, if it still stands, is the same building that Thomas entered for worship, its stones laid by hands that have been dust for centuries. The name of the village, if it has kept its name, is a thread connecting the present to the past. and the human needs remain. The people who live there today still need food and shelter, still form families and communities, still seek meaning and belonging. They satisfy these needs differently, but the needs themselves are unchanged, as old as humanity, as permanent as anything in human experience. This is the deepest continuity, deeper than genes or names, deeper than buildings or landscapes. The continuity of human nature, of the fundamental realities that all people in all times and places have shared. We are born, we live, we die. We love and we fear, we hope and we grieve. We work and we rest, we struggle and we surrender. These are the constants, the unchanging core around which all the variations of history revolve. Thomas knew these realities, lived them, breathed them every day of his life. We know them too, though we live in circumstances that would astonish him. In this knowing, we are connected to him, as we are connected to all who have lived, as we will be connected to all who will live after us. The hour is very late now. The story has stretched on, reluctant to end, wanting to say more, to capture more of the vanished world it has tried to evoke. But all stories must end, and this one has reached its conclusion. The medieval peasant is at rest. Thomas and Agnes sleep their final sleep in the churchyard, their bodies long since returned to the earth, their souls committed to the mercy of God. Their children sleep too, and their grandchildren, and all the generations that have followed, an endless succession of lives lived and ended. And you are moving towards sleep as well, feeling the heaviness in your limbs, the slowness in your thoughts, the gentle pull of unconsciousness. The story has done its work, carrying you away from the concerns of the present, opening a window into a distant past, creating a space of quiet and peace. Let yourself go now. Let the images fade, the words dissolve, the mind grow still. The medieval village will wait for you, preserved in memory, available whenever you wish to return. For now there is only rest, only peace, only the deep surrender of sleep. The peasants would understand. They knew the value of rest, the necessity of sleep, the rhythm of waking and sleeping that governs all life. They would not grudge you this rest, would wish you well as you enter the darkness, would send you off with whatever blessing their simple faith could provide. Accept that blessing, accept the peace of the night, accept the gift of sleep that comes at the end of every day. The fire is out, the cottage is dark, the village sleeps, and so do you. Good night, and so do you. Good night.